6 months ago, the US went to war with Iran with an enormous advantage. It had overwhelming air power, superior intelligence and surveillance, advanced precision weapons, support from Israel, and the ability to strike targets virtually anywhere inside Iran. Iran couldn't compete with the US conventionally, and yet 6 months later, something unexpected has happened. Iran has not collapsed. Its supreme leader was killed. Dozens of senior officials were eliminated. Its military infrastructure was heavily bombed, but the regime survived. More importantly, the Iran emerging from the war may actually be more hardline than the one that entered it. Its missile infrastructure has proved far harder to neutralize than expected. Iran has demonstrated that it's prepared to attack American partners across the Gulf. And Tehran has discovered that the Strait of Hormuz may provide something even more strategically valuable than its nuclear program, a way of imposing enormous costs not just on the US, but on the global economy. So how did the world's most powerful military end up here? Because I think this war exposes a fundamental problem with the way we think about military power. Being able to destroy your opponent's assets is not the same thing as being able to make your opponent do what you want. And that distinction is the heart of what went wrong. The first miscalculation, expecting Iran to collapse. Let's start with what may have been the most ambitious assumption behind the campaign. There appears to have been a belief in Washington and Tel Aviv that military strikes might trigger something inside Iran. The regime was unpopular. There had been widespread protests. There were opposition groups. There were contacts with senior Iranians. And Israel reportedly had an extraordinary regime change plan involving Iranian Kurdish groups and former Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. According to the account, the plan envisioned Kurdish forces moving into Iran under Israeli and American air cover. An internal uprising would follow. Ahmadinejad would potentially emerge as a successor. And then Mossad chief David Barnea reportedly believed the government could collapse within days. But there was a fundamental problem. Nobody actually knew how much support existed inside Iran for overthrowing the regime, particularly during a foreign military attack. And that's an incredibly important distinction. You can dislike your government without wanting foreign forces to overthrow it. You can oppose a regime without supporting Kurdish militias entering the country. And you can want political change without wanting your state to collapse. The US intelligence community itself reportedly warned before the attack that neither limited strikes nor a prolonged campaign was likely to generate an opposition movement capable of taking power. But several individually certain possibilities appear to have created confidence that something would happen. Many senior officials would defect. Maybe opposition groups would mobilize. Maybe the Kurds would advance. Maybe Ahmadinejad could provide political leadership. But enough maybes together, and suddenly they can start to look like a strategy. But probabilities don't necessarily work that way. Several low probability assumptions don't automatically add up to one high probability outcome, and the uprising never materialized. Furthermore, there was the Erdogan problem. The Kurdish component also revealed this. The actors opposing Iran didn't necessarily agree on what should replace it. President Erdogan of Turkey reportedly intervened directly with President Trump over the prospect of Kurdish forces moving into Iran. At the 11th hour, Trump stopped the operation. That makes complete strategic sense from Turkey's perspective. An empowered Kurdish military force operating across another neighboring state is almost the opposite of what Ankara wants. And this illustrates a much larger problem. Israel, Turkey, the Gulf states, and the US may all have reasons to want Iran weakened, but that doesn't mean they want the same post-war Iran. Israel may see considerable strategic benefit in permanently weakening or fragmenting Iranian power. Turkey doesn't want Kurdish territorial or military consolidation. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar may increasingly prefer a contained but functioning Iranian government capable of enforcing agreements. And the US wants an Iran that cannot threaten American interests, regional allies, or eventually acquire nuclear weapons. Those objectives overlap, but they are not identical, which means the coalition becomes much harder to manage once the question changes from how do we weaken Iran to what exactly are we trying to create? Let's move to the second miscalculation. Iran would not attack the Gulf. This next assumption initially looked quite reasonable. Iran surely would not attack the Gulf states. I mean, why would it? Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and others had increasingly important economic relationships with Iran. Several had spent years improving relations with Tehran. Attacking them would turn potential intermediaries into enemies. And historically, Iran had been cautious. After previous confrontations with Israel and the US, Tehran generally signaled privately to Gulf governments that it did not intend to attack them. So Washington had evidence. The mistake was assuming that past Iranian behavior represented a permanent Iranian strategy. It may actually have represented Khomeini's strategy. For decades, Iran's supreme leader, the former Ayatollah Khomeini, had often believed being one of the forces restraining the military establishment from escalating too far. Then in March, the US killed him, along with 40 other senior Iranian officials who were mostly moderate. And suddenly the decision-making system changed. Iran subsequently launched hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones against the Gulf states and Jordan. Now, importantly, this possibility wasn't completely missed. American intelligence reportedly warned that Iran could retaliate against the Gulf capitals. British intelligence apparently went further and assessed such attacks as highly probable if Iran felt cornered. So this wasn't an intelligence failure in the sense that nobody imagined this scenario. It was a probability failure. And there's an enormous difference between telling a president Iran could attack our Gulf partners and instead saying, if we kill the supreme leader and launch a sustained attack across Iran, we should expect Tehran to expand the war. The first statement sounds like a risk. The second sounds like a consequence. Now, the third miscalculation. America could bury Iran's missiles. Now we come to what may be the most interesting military lesson. Iran stores much of its missile and drone arsenal deep inside mountains. Some of these facilities are extraordinarily deep. So rather than trying to destroy every missile, American and Israeli planners pursued a clever alternative. Destroy the tunnel entrances, destroy the access roads, trap the weapons underground, and suddenly thousands of missiles that technically still exist become operationally useless. Initially, the strategy appeared highly successful. US and Israeli strikes reportedly hit 69 tunnel entrances across 18 underground facilities. Entrances collapsed, roads were cratered, launchers could not get out. Then Iran did something extraordinarily low-tech. It bought in bulldozers and dump trucks and front-end loaders. By late May, commercial satellite imagery reportedly showed Iran had reopened 50 of those 69 entrances. Repairs, most of the roads were done, and restored access to many of the facilities. The missiles themselves were buried under hundreds of feet of granite and largely survived. Think about the asymmetry here. America used some of the most sophisticated military technology in existence. Iran responded with construction equipment. And that's important because it demonstrates another problem. The US had drawn lessons from its previous success against Iran's Fordow nuclear facility in 2025. But a nuclear enrichment facility and a missile storage facility are not the same thing. Nuclear enrichment requires centrifuges, precision components, specialized infrastructure. Rebuilding it is extraordinarily complicated. A missile bunker needs something much simpler, just a protected storage space and a road out. Now, America was fighting the last war. And this brings us to why this may have been a broader analytical failure. The US had learned a series of lessons from the 12-day war in 2025. Iran had retaliated carefully. Hezbollah largely stayed out. The Houthis contributed relatively little. The facility in Fordow had been successfully neutralized. Every observation was accurate. The problem was assuming those behaviors would continue under completely different circumstances. Iran's restraint in 2025 largely depended on Ayatollah Khamenei. So killing Khamenei changed the equation. Hezbollah and the Houthis had been weakened, but weakened did not mean irrelevant. And success against nuclear infrastructure didn't mean the same strategy would work against Iran's distributed missile network. In other words, America learned from the previous war, but it learned all the wrong lessons. And this is where Hormuz changes everything. Because Iran cannot defeat the US militarily. It doesn't have to. And this is where game theory becomes useful. If you're the weaker player, you don't need to try and beat the stronger player on its own game. You change the game. Iran's objective increasingly appears to be to make continued military action progressively more expensive, not simply by destroying aircraft or bases, but through energy markets, shipping, insurance, interceptor depletion, Gulf security, inflation, and ultimately political pressure. Which brings us back to the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's new leadership increasingly appears to view control of the Hormuz as a strategic deterrent. Mohsen Rezai, who is the new leader of the National Security Council in Iran, has reportedly said the control of the strait matters to Iran more than a dozen nuclear bombs. At first, that sounds like rhetoric, but strategically, there's logic behind it. Iran's nuclear program was supposed to create deterrence. The US demonstrated that it was willing to attack it. Hormuz creates a very different form of deterrence because bombing an Iranian nuclear installation primarily imposes costs on Iran. Disrupting Hormuz imposes costs on everybody: China, Europe, Japan, the Gulf states, global consumers, financial markets, everybody. Suddenly, a US-Iran war is no longer simply a contest between two countries. It becomes a problem for the global economy, and that gives the weaker player leverage. And the Gulf has learned something too. This is another consequence of this war, which I think is receiving much less attention. The wealthy Gulf states have discovered that hosting American forces doesn't necessarily insulate them from conflict. It can make them a part of it. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE did not choose this war, but they were exposed to its consequences, and that changes their incentives. They now have a very strong reason to deepen their own diplomatic channels with Tehran and make sure another US-Iran confrontation doesn't turn their territory into the battlefield. That doesn't mean they're becoming Iranian allies, far from it. It means they're hedging, and that could gradually produce a Middle East in which Gulf governments rely less exclusively on American security guarantees and increasingly pursue their own arrangements with Iran, China, Turkey, and other powers. Ironically, a war intended to reinforce American deterrence seems to accelerate a more multipolar regional security system. So, what does this all mean for the US? In one sentence, more feared but less trusted. America has certainly demonstrated something important. It has shown to the Russians, the Chinese, Iranians, and everybody else that's willing, it's willing to use extraordinary military force. It's willing to strike a nuclear threshold state. It's willing to kill its leadership. It's willing to absorb considerable retaliation, economically and strategically, and that matters. America may therefore emerge from this conflict more feared. But there's another side to the equation. US military power could not prevent its Gulf partners from being attacked. It couldn't quickly neutralize Iran's missile infrastructure. It has consumed substantial interceptor inventories. And despite enormous military damage, it hasn't produced the political transformation originally anticipated. So America may be feared, but also seems to simultaneously emerge less trusted. For allies of the US, the question becomes, America can certainly start a war, but can it control what happens afterwards? And for adversaries, there's an equally uncomfortable lesson. For them, they believe that America can inflict extraordinary damage. But if you can survive that damage, perhaps survival itself becomes victory. So what's the bigger lesson in all this? This brings us back to the paradox at the center of this war. The US entered with overwhelming conventional superiority. Iran entered knowing it could never win a conventional fight. But 6 months later, the conflict increasingly revolves around precisely those areas where America's conventional superiority matters less. Underground tunnels, cheap drones, missile inventories, maritime choke points, oil prices, political endurance, and the willingness to absorb pain. Iran doesn't need to defeat America. It just needs to convince the US that the next month of war costs more than whatever Washington expects to gain from it. And if Iran can do that, the strategic calculation changes. That's why I don't think the most important question is whether Iran won or America lost. Those terms are way too simplistic. Iran has suffered enormous damage. Its leadership was decapitated. Its military infrastructure was degraded. Its economy has suffered. But America has not achieved the political outcome that overwhelming military superiority might have suggested was possible. Instead, both sides are adapting, and that may eventually create a strange equilibrium. Iran remains militarily weaker, but increasingly expensive to attack. America remains overwhelmingly stronger, but increasingly reluctant to use that strength. The Gulf states increasingly hedge between Washington and Tehran, and the Strait of Hormuz becomes not simply a shipping lane, but the mechanism that keeps the entire system in balance. There is a profound irony in that. The campaign was intended, at least in part, to destroy Iran's deterrence. Instead, it may have helped Iran discover a different form of deterrence, not nuclear, not conventional, economic. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson from this war. Military superiority determines how much damage you can inflict. It doesn't necessarily determine who controls the game. Thank you.